What's your name and what do you do?
Richard Arum. I'm a professor of sociology and education at New York University and program director of education and research at the Social Science Research Council.
And you just wrote a book that's getting a lot of attention. Why don't you tell us the name and why it's getting attention?
Yeah, I co-wrote the book with Josipa Roksa. The book is entitled Academically Adrift, Limited Learning on College Campuses. It's getting lots of attention because the book focuses on following a large number of students through a diverse set of colleges and universities to see what their academic experiences are in colleges and universities and how much learning they demonstrate on a standardized assessment measure.
And you actually find that 45% of students don't learn anything in their first 2 years.
First 2 years, and 36% don't move up on this indicator after 4 years.
Mm-hmm. And reporters, I know, often are now being asked to write about this kind of thing. How can they use your information to cover their local colleges and local universities?
Great. Well, I think because most colleges and universities don't make data of this nature publicly available, they would be best to start off with some of the measures we tracked in terms of student college experiences that are associated with learning outcomes. And that is expectations of reading expectations in their courses, writing expectations in their courses, the traditional measures of academic rigor. And those things are much more easily identifiable in colleges and universities today.
So if I'm covering a local university or college, I should call them up and ask them how many pages of reading does your typical professor assign, or what
Well, again, I wouldn't, that would assume that the administrators had that knowledge. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to call up an administrator, I would ask a slightly different question. Our book finds that there are pockets of excellence, and then there are other pockets where students are moving through colleges and universities with little asked of them and little learned. And every college and university that we studied had both those pockets. Mm. And so what I would ask an administrator, if I was either a parent or a reporter, is what are you doing to assess learning on your campus, to identify the pockets of excellence and the pockets that need improvement? What are your plans for improving those areas that need improvement? How are you measuring and assessing it to make sure those plans are put in place? Those are type of basic questions that one would expect an administrator of any school, elementary, secondary, college, and university, would be able to answer. And if they can't answer that, if they don't know, if they're not following and tracking course quality and academic rigor and can't answer basic questions like what's the reading requirements and writing requirements of typical courses, how does that vary across majors, across programs, and so on, then a good reporter could go not to the administrator but go to the faculty, ask to see like the Chronicle of Higher Education did in Texas, where the syllabi are publicly available. Asked to see course syllabi, asked to see measure themselves in typical courses. What are the reading requirements? What are the writing requirements? Mm-hmm. How do we understand the fact that we identified in our book that students' time on task, students' hours they spend preparing for their coursework, doing homework, preparing for their coursework, how do we understand the fact that that's dropped in half in recent decades? Mm-hmm. That we've gone from full-time college students spending 25 hours per week to 12 or 13 hours per week. And of that 12 or 13 hours per week, a third of that is studying in groups, hanging out with their friends where little's learned. And so we have in our study, we identified 36% of the students in our study report spending 5 or fewer hours per week studying alone. So how can that be? These same students are getting a 3.16 GPA when we look at their transcripts, spending 5 or fewer hours per week. How can that be? Well, a reporter can find out how that could be by going to the college and university and taking a look at the syllabi to see how it's possible to to move through college and university was so easily with so little asked of them.
Okay, so if I'm looking at the syllabi, I should be looking for, I think, 40 pages of writing?
No, the measures we used in our study were the following. We asked students how many courses did they take where how many courses did they take where they wrote more than 20 pages over the course of the semester, 20 pages over the course of the semester, not necessarily a single course. And 50% in their sophomore year said, we didn't take any course the first semester of our sophomore year where we wrote more than 20 pages over the course of the semester.
But classes that required less than 20 pages of writing
over the course of the semester,
were associated with less learning.
Exactly. And then in terms of reading, we asked the question, how many courses did you take where you read more than 40 pages per week on average? More than 40, that's where the 40 pages comes. And 32% said, I don't have any course where I was asked to read more than 40 pages per week on average. These are things that are kind of easy to measure, easy to ask, and one could explore. Now, in the book, we also show how that varies from major to major, how some academic programs are less rigorous than others. A motivated reporter could go to a college and university and with just a little digging find out to the extent to which the findings in the book hold up or don't at the college and university in their local community.
And the other thing they can do is, do you want to talk about the voluntary system of accountability? Or?
Well, so there's a separate effort going on called the voluntary system of accountability, where I believe something like 300 colleges and universities in this country took a pledge that they would assess learning on their college campuses with objective measures like the kind of measure we used in our book. The collegiate learning assessment is one that we used in the book, but there were two other type of assessment indicators as well, one called CAP, one called MAP. And they could use one of those three. They would assess learning freshman to senior year and make those data public. Those data are supposed to be made public in the near future. And that would be another source of information out there.
That's one way you can find out if your college or university, if students are actually learning, and if your school is not participating, what would you want to ask why they aren't participating?
Well, okay. So again, for me, the better question than the demand for measure learning and make it transparent and publicly available. Some people have asked for that. I think a better question a reporter can ask is, how are you measuring learning internally? How are you doing it? How are you identifying pockets of excellence and pockets that need improvement? What are your plans for improving the areas that don't work? And so you don't necessarily have to jump to let's see the test score outcomes. You can ask a much simpler question, and that is, are you measuring learning outcomes? How are you measuring them? What are your plans for improving undergraduate learning on your college and campus? And again, every college and university in the country, no matter how selective, no matter how elite, should be doing that kind of work, because every school, regardless of level, can do better. And every school, you would think, would be measuring and self-assessing and doing these sorts of exercises.
Okay, and just lastly, could you address the criticism of your study that what you find is there's no evidence that 45% of students are learning on this particular test, but maybe that doesn't mean that they're not actually learning? Well,
again, our study was absolutely limited to one assessment measure. I think ideally, if you could do this, and we've called for a federal effort to measure, create a longitudinal data set for basic science like exists in elementary and secondary education, in higher education. Ideally, you don't use just one measure. You also want to measure subject-specific skills. You'd want to measure other competencies like civic engagement and so on. We don't measure them all. I wish we could. However, I'd say two things in response. One, if students are spending less than 5 hours per week studying alone, what measure do you think they're going to be going up on? And then the second thing I would say is there's another large-scale study that was organized out of Wabash with multiple colleges and universities that used a different measure, the CAP measure. Again, one of the other three that was is part of the voluntary system of accountability. And they're finding very similar patterns. The Wabash study also measures some other competencies like moral development, moral reasoning, and so on. And the place where they're seeing any gains at all are the ones that similar to the higher order skills that we measured with the CLA, but again, only a limited gains, and only limited gains because, again, the amount of time college students are spending studying and preparing in class has dropped in half, and large numbers of them are able to navigate through colleges and universities with little asked of them, with little application of effort, and with little learning on the measure we use, but one would expect on virtually any measure, given that effort and those demands being placed on them.
Okay, so more, high reading requirements, high writing requirements. I think I remember, and also no study groups, rather study alone are the keys, right? Studying,
yeah. The one thing we find is that the more colleges and universities have been doing a lot of social engagement, trying to encourage students to interact with each other more, interact with clubs and social activities. These things are thought to track with retention in school so that the kids don't drop out. And of course, they don't drop out because they're engaged, they're integrated with the college, they're having fun. However, they don't track with learning outcomes, objective measures of learning outcomes. Nice. So studying in groups would be one of those things. Social engagement, it might track with keeping kids in colleges and universities, but if it's unstructured, like the type that exists on college campuses today, it's not going to track with learning outcomes in a positive way. In fact, it might even track in a negative way, like we saw in our work.
And I think I remember that fraternities and sororities were not a positive. Is that correct?
We found, again, on average, similar to studying in groups, the more hours you spent in a fraternity and sorority, the more likely it is that the second time you took this test, your score would actually go down. It would decrease.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks, Kim.